In April 1863, uneasy Canadians watched the terrible Civil War in America enter its third bloody year. Most Canadians opposed slavery and therefore had tended to support the Union. And Canadian business wanted nothing to disturb the boom in trade with the North. But Britain, while proclaiming neutrality, had angered the North by recognizing the Confederacy as a belligerent, and soon Northern interference with British shipping threatened to embroil the Union in full-scale war with Britain. If war came, Canada would be a certain target. But would it be defended? Some thought Britain had become indifferent to North America, or that the colonies themselves would not resist because they felt that sooner or later their absorption into the Union was inevitable. But Britain unhesitatingly rushed troops to Quebec, and the vigorous cooperation of all Canadian groups, English, French, Irish, firmly revealed their preference for a future separate from the United States. Outright war was avoided, but although Anglo-American tension remained dangerous, complacent Canadian politicians couldn't even agree on a stronger militia bill. Some felt that they had a sure defense in the Confederate Army, which was now invading the North. But on July the 4th, the Battle of Gettysburg ended with the Confederates in full retreat, and on the same day, the fall of Vicksburg split the Confederacy in two.
Weary President Lincoln had found his man at last, the victor of Vicksburg, Ulysses S. Grant. Taciturn and tenacious, he was soon turning the vastly superior potential of the North into an unrelenting offensive against the outnumbered and desperate Confederates. From Chattanooga to the Wilderness, Grant's massive armies harried and pursued the failing Confederate forces. And by late 1864, the crumbling of Southern armies indicated that the Union would triumph. In the new Union armies, none were more capable or more dashing than the Irish. But even as they rose to distinction in the service of the Union, many a homesick Irishman brooded on another cause, Irish freedom and the Fenian Brotherhood. The roots of Fenianism lay in the harsh soil of Irish misery. Overpopulation and the failure of the potato crop had produced stark famine in the hungry 40s. Hundreds of thousands of helpless and demoralized people perished, despite desperate relief efforts. Rebellion had followed in 1848, but it was ill-organized and ineffective and had been easily crushed. Ruthless evictions had been justified by the oppressive landlord class as the only solution to Irish overpopulation. The dispossessed cotters had no choice but to emigrate. With them, they carried a deep hatred of England, and this had found expression in the Fenian Brotherhood. By 1863, it was powerful enough to hold a convention and declare a Republic of Ireland free from Britain. In pursuit of this great dream, the Fenians fostered a mood of conspiracy and violence and called for the use of terror against England. To the north, under the lingering skies of a Canadian summer, even the frowning fortress of Quebec seemed peaceful. Yet Canada remained tense and heavily garrisoned. The war scare had brought to North America the biggest contingent of crack British troops since 1814. Thus, Britain's resolve that the future of the colonies was not to be determined by American power alone was unmistakably backed up by the whole might of the empire. And the colonists themselves proved enthusiastic and grateful hosts. But in London, there was a growing feeling among British politicians that a firm imperial posture in North America, however necessary for the moment, couldn't be maintained indefinitely. The truth was, John Bull was feeling the pinch where it hurt most. For there was a high price tag on the arms of empire. Only the newest designs could keep Britain's navy supreme. Only widely scattered facilities could keep ready the great Atlantic fleet, which Palmerston had alerted in case of war with America. And North American winters meant long layups and expensive idleness. As the military bills were added up at Westminster, the suspicion grew on both sides of the House that imperialism was becoming more give than take. Men like Richard Cobden had long argued that colonies were more loss than gain, and they struggled to bridle the British lion's costly fits of imperial temper. Other members on both sides felt that the colonies should pay for helpful imperial roars, but were as anxious to keep the flag flying as the anti-imperialists were to pull it down. Yet it could be said of most people in Britain in the 60s, whether wealthy or working class, that for them, imperial affairs ran second to problems at home. But behind the Roman facades of British finance, there was already at work a new kind of imperialism, whose origin lay in the ever-expanding productivity of British capitalism. Skilled muscle and pounding machinery had turned all England into a workshop whose products were of a variety and volume which dwarfed anything ever known before. A determined new breed of men, investors and financiers rather than owners, discussed in their drawing rooms and clubs new concepts like the climate of investment. Soon, politicians were feeling their influence. Lobbying was the preferred method. A quiet word here, a timely introduction there, and everywhere the hint that since business was so obviously good for Britain, British governments should be concerned with making things good for business. So they haunted the corridors of power, confident that if money talked, it would be listened to, perhaps by a cabinet minister or an important member of a board of trade. Free trade. 30 years of it had tripled Britain's exports. Could not the expansion of British commerce everywhere give new meaning and justification to the imperial system? The explosion of industrial productivity meant that the nation's power and prosperity could now be pushed up and up by a ceaseless export drive, the only limit being the capacity to deliver the goods. Britain's ship owners did deliver the goods, but investors found that risks could be great and rates high on routes that now stretched literally to the ends of the earth, to distant and indispensable depots like Melbourne in booming Australia, Canton, where politics were complicated and unpredictable, and Hong Kong, open door to China. So in certain British business circles of the 60s, there arose the vision of a world-girdling system of communications. It was a truly imperial vision, which looked to the imperial government for support and subsidy. British North America had a vital role to play in this system, as a bridge between the Atlantic and the Pacific. It could become part of a shorter route from London to the Orient. The link, of course, would be a transcontinental railway. At the moment, no more than a dream. Promoters from bitter experience with colonial railroads knew that the best-laid schemes didn't always convince London. Even the intercolonial railroad scheme had failed to win effective imperial backing, despite the possibility of an American alternative. Unsound railroads had already lured many victims in Britain and Canada into wild speculation. Many a promoter, carried along by reckless expenditure, ran far ahead of his financial resources. But if plans for eastward expansion had to be scrapped, the frustrated imperialists of Toronto could still dream of appropriating the trade and land of the Northwest. This dream, too, faced many obstacles. North of Lake Superior, a road or telegraph line seemed ambitious enough, let alone a railroad. Only a trickle of Canadian settlers had filtered through to the Great Plains, and only a very few had made the long, hard journey overland to the forests and peaks of British Columbia. For them, the lure was gold, not settlement. On the plains, the number of independent traders steadily increased, and the authority of the Hudson's Bay Company steadily declined. Yet the Northwest remained almost unchanged. Its great prairies were as empty as ever in their vast sweep along the unguarded frontier, across which lay the outposts of a troubled Union. Realists were forced to admit that the present Canada and its traditional economy could underwrite little expansion. Reciprocity with the United States had meant substantial growth for traditional exports, and these had also held their markets in Britain, despite loss of preference. But a feeling in business circles that the economy was inadequate and already starting to stagnate was shared by men like A.T. Galt. As Canada's Minister of Finance, his chief worry had been that revenues fell increasingly short of covering her expenditures, a concern also shared by his French compatriot, Georges-Étienne Cartier. Their colleague, John A. Macdonald, felt that only wider economic horizons could make Canada solvent. The scattered British North American colonies had obvious potential, if only they could be economically associated. But could you, asked Macdonald, ever have economic cooperation without political unity? A united British North America would be more than a bridge. The St. Lawrence system would have a Canadian hinterland, instead of competing with New York for the trade of the American West. And if a united British North America could be created, a British-backed transcontinental railway, advocated by men like Edward Watkin in London, would be a more appealing proposition. For such a railway would be not only a link in a worldwide system, but also the spine of a new transcontinental nation.
Desperate for credit, Galt had proposed a general federation in 1858, but London had shown limited enthusiasm for a scheme it felt premature. Meanwhile, Edward Watkin's International Financial Society had acquired a major interest in the debt-ridden Grand Trunk Railway and in the Hudson's Bay Company. There was method in the financial madness of this shrewd underwriter and reorganizer. Soon he was lobbying everywhere for the notion that federation would completely revitalize British North America's economic prospects, including his own, of course. London, though encouraging discussion, remained uncommitted. But suddenly, late in 1863, the British cabinet made federation official policy. Encouraged, John A. Macdonald arranged a truce among Canadian politicians, and at Charlottetown, Prince Edward Island, in September 1864, Canadian and maritime delegates found enough in common to continue at Quebec in October. Here, tentative agreement on a federation was reached. The second transcontinental nation had taken its first step. Why did Britain act when she did? During the war scare of 1861, Britain had shown that she would not abandon Canada to the United States. But she didn't care to go on repeating the demonstration. Moreover, it was clear that the Union was going to win. What if she found in the British presence to the north an excuse for settling old scores? But if Britain were to withdraw, it must be without loss of prestige in the eyes of the United States. Canadian Federation seemed a basis for just such a withdrawal with honor. A stronger Canada, standing on its own, might be acceptable to the United States. Then, suddenly, more trouble.
In Richmond, Southern leaders knew by 1864 that their strategy for winning Britain's support had failed. Mighty King Cotton, who was to have won recognition, had been shackled, and the Union Eagle was tearing at the Confederacy's vitals. In Canada's larger towns, Confederate agents had been working to crystallize anti-Northern feeling. Well-financed, they operated from the better hotels. Typical was George Sanders, a fanatical Confederate whose legitimate propaganda seemed something else to the anti-Canadian press of the North. But by the fall of 1864, the hotel lobbies were full of rumors that more serious schemes were afoot. Tension grew as Union agents tried to watch the Confederates, and Canadian agents tried to watch everybody. Finally, in mid-October, a group of desperate Confederates descended from Canada to raid the town of St. Albans, Vermont. This brought a roar of rage from the north. But in a few days, the Confederate criminals were arrested by Canadian authorities. In Washington, where 4 years of war had stretched nerves to the breaking point, it was hardly surprising that the Eagle screamed. For long enough, it had felt itself surrounded by enemies on all sides. The cocksure France of Napoleon III, Britain, the ancient foe, and now, her nasty offspring. It was hardly surprising that some angry congressmen were willing to back any sort of countermeasure, even a military one. But Secretary of State Seward, while agreeing to suspend the Rush-Bagot Agreement, preferred to play for concessions from an embarrassed Lord Monck. Unfortunately, a preliminary hearing of the St. Albans raiders ended abruptly when they were released on technical grounds by the Canadian judge. Soon, a renewed wave of anger enabled the congressional enemies of free trade to win adoption of a resolution terminating the Reciprocity Treaty. There was no lack of will, it seemed, for taking John Bull by the throat. The bitter American election of late 1864 helped inflame the crisis, for strong words made good politics. Lincoln did win a second term, but 4 years of war had taken a terrible toll, and the weary president wanted only to end the conflict. So the administration tried to limit the scope of retaliation against Canada, suggesting she had been careless rather than hostile. Early in 1865, the Canadian legislature was summoned by Lord Monck, who had been working to counter American extremists. Soon, watchful newspapers in the North reported the passage of a new act closely regulating the movements of aliens in Canada. Uncle Sam calmed down.
Confederate dreams of Anglo-American war might have come true if General Dix's dangerous order to ignore the Canadian border had stood for very long. But Seward had Lincoln revoke it. The Confederate plotters were too late. Had the raid occurred in 1861, when Seward was suspected of wanting war with England, it might have changed history. But now Seward saw a Confederate trap and would not risk imminent victory by expanding the war. So he bargained for a limited goal, a stronger Canadian neutrality law, and Monk responded. Soon, Seward quietly reinstated the Rush-Bagot Agreement. Reciprocity, however, was gone beyond recall. Amidst all this, the Canadian legislature debated the Confederation scheme, which English and French Canadians saw rather differently.
The English of Upper Canada had grown steadily in self-confidence. For some time, they had felt themselves ready for a fuller nationality, and they looked with approval on the efforts of the political tailors in London to get their gangling colonial lads into more grown-up togs. Unification by peaceful means contrasted sharply with the doleful plight of poor Columbia. Real sympathy could hardly conceal a certain smugness, nor could the Canadian image of America remain unaffected by the inflammatory propaganda of North and South, inspired by mutual hate. Too true were the realities of race hate and social violence. The uninhibited side of American politics had confirmed traditional anti-Republican prejudices among English Canadians. They saw a caricature of Uncle Sam, and although graft and corruption were really worldwide, they were apt to think of them as distinctively American. That this brash customer could still be taken in hand by John Bull was reassuring. And who else but John could talk to Sam on equal terms? John Bull should stay in the picture, English Canadians felt, even as they welcomed Federation. For French Canadians, the issue of Federation was not so simple. For them, the British presence was not the result of choice, but the consequence of a lost imperial war. There had been military surrender to superior British power, but no spiritual surrender. British troops maintained British sovereignty, and men like Sir John Colborne, who crushed their revolt in 1837, symbolized the brutal fact of alien occupation. So whenever the Yankee cousin twisted the British lion's tail, radical French opinion was apt to enjoy it. But a Roman Catholic clergy of great ability had taken over leadership of the struggle to preserve the French-Canadian nation. Church leaders had never forgotten the devilish forms in which the American revolutionaries had depicted Catholicism, nor that extremist opinion in Protestant America was intent on making the church sever its ties with Rome. Homage to the Pope became servility in the ugly caricatures of American alarmists who felt endangered by creeping Catholicism. bugaboo about a world-embracing Catholic imperialism was widespread in America. Yet despite anti-American feelings, some church leaders were hesitant, and among many laymen there were doubts about giving up a union where they had been equals for a federation where they would be a minority. Their leader was A.A. Dorion, who attacked the Federation scheme as a monster, whose many English-speaking heads would swallow a helpless Quebec. French-Canadian leaders in federal politics would soon become French-speaking Englishmen, he said, sacrificing Quebec to the majority. But Georges-Étienne Cartier, Macdonald's French lieutenant, thought otherwise. If the association between English and French in Canada could not be developed, annexation to the United States would follow, reducing Quebec to political impotence. The British connection was invaluable, said Cartier. Had not the best ally against local abuse of French rights always been the British Crown? As for Quebec, it would move ahead with the expansion of the new Canada and its railways. Railways in which, as it happened, Cartier had investments. The press was sharply divided. But Dorion's supporters lost out to Cartier's by a narrow margin. With the results of the debate now clear, the church felt it should throw the full weight of its authority behind the majority decisions. The choice was simply the lesser of two evils, necessary for self-preservation.
One key vote in the legislature was revealing. English-speaking members voted 65 for, 11 against. Not much doubt there. Indeed, the English had everything to gain. Representation in the new federal parliament would be by population, and their increasing numbers should mean control. Freed from French obstruction, Confederation, they felt, would be progressive, liberal, prosperous, and Protestant, just like them. French-speaking members voted 26 for, 22 against. Plenty of doubt there. Those for Confederation had seen two choices: annexation to the United States and probable absorption, or Confederation. The English would get what could no longer be denied them anyway, but the French would at least have local government with entrenched rights, which guaranteed survival.
In Washington, on March 4th, 1865, President Lincoln was inaugurated for his second term. Victory for the Union cause was in sight. On April 2nd, as Grant's armies closed in, rebel President Davis ordered Richmond's arsenals and factories destroyed. Next day, when Union troops entered the city, the end of the Confederacy was at hand. Davis was forced to flee. Union had prevailed, and in Richmond, the great emancipator was welcomed by former slaves. But the troubled and far-seeing president, even with the cheers of the victors ringing in his ears, never ceased to brood over the future of the defeated. The South's physical power lay largely in ruins. But could its racial philosophy be as easily destroyed as its railroads and factories? Could the South be brought to trust the future rather than a haunted and corrupting past? Only by a peace of reconciliation, said Lincoln. And he ordered that Confederate prisoners be returned quickly to their homes. Lincoln had said, "With malice toward none, with charity for all, let us strive to bind up the wounds." It was not to be. Lincoln's dream of reconciliation was buried with him, and unchecked sectional prejudice soon frustrated his national aspirations. In Canada, a profound wave of sympathy swept the provinces. Only in death did the patience and tact of a true friend show through all misunderstanding at last. Already the armies of the Union, now the most powerful in the world, were flooding northward, and, Canadians silently hoped, homewards. And now that Lincoln was gone, what sort of men, Canadians were asking, might it serve? Andrew Johnson, the new president, was thought a weak and troubled character. Behind him stood Ulysses Grant and Phil Sheridan, masters of war, and Thaddeus Stevens, who hated the Confederates and felt the time had come at last for the court of American opinion to put the Confederacy's erstwhile friends on trial. Louis Napoleon and those scoundrels, Punch and the editor of the Times. But it was the score at sea that most needed settling in the American view. And here, the guilty party was clear. John Bull had given the Confederates much more than sympathy. The struggle for American unity had evoked powerful emotions, which were now reflected in a stronger nationalism. Many Canadians feared that the banner of manifest destiny would be unfurled over the whole continent. A new confidence and vigilance certainly were in evidence, especially with regard to Britain and France, who were felt to be bowled over by America's new naval strength. In 1864, Napoleon III had sent a French army to install the Austrian Archduke Maximilian as Emperor of Mexico. But Secretary Seward insisted that the Monroe Doctrine be respected, and the French reluctantly withdrew. But what about that other villain, Johnny Bull? Were not some of his best imperial troops standing along America's northern frontier? Some raucous voices suggested that the Monroe Doctrine should apply to these Europeans too. Might not the victorious Union commanders now look northward and find new uses for their veterans? So the news that the great armies of the Union were to be demobilized quickly was greeted with joy. With the utmost relief, Canadians saw the victors head for home. But one group, the fanatical Fenian Brotherhood, was now ready to begin its own war. The rapid disbanding of the Union armies made battle-hardened Irish veterans suddenly available. Many, without immediate work, were easily recruited into the anti-British Brotherhood. Soon there were widespread rumors that the Fenian plotters were up to something big. Military forces in Canada were frequently on the alert in early 1866. For, as Canadians pointed out to a seemingly apathetic Washington, the Fenians had decided to free Ireland by attacking British power in Canada. In June, the liberation of Ireland began. The fire of the Fenian veterans threw the first Canadian forces which opposed them briefly off balance. But reinforcements, rushed to the main danger points, soon forced Fenian withdrawal. But there had been casualties, and Canada seethed with anger. John Bull felt that now Uncle Sam should recognize the Fenians for what they were. Sam did seem more disposed to listen. Steps were quickly taken to round up returning Fenians, and a proclamation made invasion activities illegal. The administration might not yet be willing to deal with Fenians in the Canadian fashion, but it did seem willing to cool them off. The real Fenian menace lay in the larger explosion they might cause in the powder keg of the American Congress, where a powerful charge of anti-British feeling had accumulated during the war. The American eagle was in a self-righteous mood, and the rascally British lion must expect to pay for his recent sins against the Union. Complicating everything was the sour relationship existing at the end of the war between catty Columbia and haughty Britannia. The bills for John Bull's Civil War escapades were now starting to come in. It looked like the claims were going to be high. The anti-Canadian mood in Congress after St. Albans had helped protectionists kill the reciprocity treaty with Canada. But Canadians who tried to change congressional minds in Washington found they were up against more than a passing mood. Slave state opposition to free state expansionism had helped Canada, but the achievement of reciprocity, too, had been helped by the particular economic outlook of the South. The South was mainly agricultural and imported most manufactures. So Southerners had always felt low tariffs meant low import prices and prosperity. But in the North, there had been increasing pressure from those who wanted protection for their growing industries through high tariffs. A venerable tradition lay behind this economic philosophy. President Washington himself, at the first inauguration, had worn a suit 100% made in America to encourage the infant textile industry. By now, the infants had grown considerably, but they showed little desire to honor the gospel of free trade, except by burying it. By war's end, the North was a major industrial power. With Southern opponents absent, protectionists had soon got tariffs raised. And when the states were reunited again, the balance of power had shifted to the powerful North. The features of modern America were beginning to appear. Already, Wall Street symbolized the increased power of business, whose lobbyists found doors in Washington open. Protectionists knew they could keep tariffs high. It was a feverish and ebullient period. Many looked west again. The war had briefly absorbed the nation's energies, but the same war had ended arguments about the future status of the West. Schemes to divide the West into slave and free were now dead. The nation was politically one now, and free territory only awaited settlers. They were into the Rocky Mountains now, into the rugged lands which would soon form states like Colorado. And to the north, they were pushing into the Nebraska Territory. Further north still, another thrust of American expansion pushed across the upper Missouri toward British North America. An old drama had a repeat performance in these lush future farmlands. There were the heroes, new claimants, eager to move westward. There were the victims, the prior claimants, blocking the road. The heroes were real. The victims were real. The ending, as always, the same. In the East, a frenzy of construction had made the 50s a golden age of railway building. By 1860, the railroad network, reaching to the Mississippi, Missouri, reflected American development. But men like Grenville Dodge were inspired by a truly imperial vision. The railway must be extended in one great push right across the Great Plains. Into them would move new millions, pursuing the American dream and building the last best west of all. Dodge's schemes were followed closely in Canada. During the war, he had won backing for his Union Pacific scheme, which anticipated their own dream of a transcontinental railway. To the mountains of Utah, the Union Pacific was now pushing westward, while out of California, the Central Pacific drove to meet it, not far from Salt Lake City. It was clear that by the end of the 60s, rails would indeed span the vast and lonely West. In Congress, meanwhile, there had been a revival of the spirit of manifest destiny. Republican radicals like Thaddeus Stevens had set a tone which could hardly be described as kindly. Strident Ben Butler could talk as if the unification of the continent was the logical completion of the task he had begun as a general against the Confederacy. Another general-turned politician was Nathaniel Banks, whose bill for the entry of Canada into the Union was too much even for anti-British congressmen. And Uncle Billy Seward reaffirmed his belief that the whole continent would soon be American. Early in 1867, in an agreement with the Tsarist government, Seward bought Russian Alaska, 4,300 miles of coastline, and 375 million acres of land, all for $7,200,000. But with only a few primitive native inhabitants, Alaska didn't seem much of a bargain. Only its implacable coldness and barrenness impressed many politicians in Washington. It was Seward's folly, many said, and the clever Russians had sold Uncle Billy a big lump of ice. In fact, Uncle Billy had placed potential American pincers around the vast western emptiness of British North America. Rapid progress on the Union Pacific also implied that Canadian expansionists had no time to lose. Already, the railroad was making expansion westward more rapid and more ruthless. Also underway was the savage extermination of the buffalo, which drove the Indians to a desperate and last-ditch resistance. Helplessly, the defeated and discouraged Indians watched as the steam monsters rolled on. The fast new trains meant the traditional overlander could now be followed by a new breed of settler, less hardy perhaps, but no less eager. There seemed no limit to those westward bound, for with the Civil War over, the doors of the American house were open again. Now, they came crowding from every corner of Europe, the greatest mass migration in the whole of history. Soon, the Union Pacific would close the last gap in its construction, while another transcontinental line, the Northern Pacific, with possible connections to Red River and British Columbia, was being talked of. Would not the human tide flowing across these lines soon overflow into the still empty lands of British North America, bringing American sovereignty with it? The harsh and stubborn wilderness north of Lake Superior made prospects for a railroad seem bleak. So if change came at last to the lands beneath the northern lights, would it not come under the stars and stripes rather than the Union Jack? And if American expansionists ever persuaded their government to annex the British Northwest as a land bridge to Alaska, who would stop them? There was danger, too, in the east, where the bizarre Fenian antics aimed at freeing Canada from Britain were instead making her cling closer to her protector. Canada's forces remained alert. Fenian propaganda actually strengthened Canada's will to survive. But in Washington, hostile congressmen who had brushed aside Canadian efforts to save reciprocity were confident that its loss would wreck Canada's economy and force her into the Union. Many prosperous Canadians had rallied to the support of reciprocity in the belief that it was indispensable. They and reciprocity's American supporters had called on Washington to renew the treaty at a great gathering in Detroit. So when Washington said no, near panic made annexationist thoughts stir again in some Canadian minds. Meanwhile, hawkish orators south of the border were reminding audiences of their destiny to rule the continent. And Secretary of State Seward did seem to many Canadians to be out to put the label U.S. on all of North America. Was Alaska, then, only a first step? This whole continent shall be, sooner or later, within the magic circle of the American Union, Seward had said. Mightn't such a man see in the Fenian wild men convenient agents for expansion? The fear that hatred of Britain might merge with American continental ambitions made Canadians feel they still needed a friend. Perhaps the hovering eagle was deterred only by the lingering prestige of the British lion.
In March 1867, an unbiased observer would have said the odds favored the absorption of British North America into the United States. Reciprocity was dead, and Southern restraint on Northern expansion was gone. Unless there was haste, all Canada's hopes might be balked forever by new American advances. The response was the final pushing through of Canadian Confederation. When the bill passed the Commons in London in March, it stirred less interest than the dog tax bill which followed. Even in Canada, where it became law on July 1st, celebrations were modest. There had been no referendum. This was just as well, for in Nova Scotia, a majority was certainly against it. So probably would have been a majority in Quebec, and New Brunswick had been scared into it by the Fenian threat. Yet the Canadian politicians had created something important.
The Dominion of Canada they had called the new creation. A pretty grand name for a pretty modest miss. For the new Dominion was simply the old province of Canada, with New Brunswick and Nova Scotia tacked on. Yet it was the first embodiment of a tantalizing dream, of something grander than the narrow vistas of colonial politics. Back in 1860 in Ottawa, the Prince of Wales had laid the cornerstone of an ambitious new parliament for the province of Canada. Now, it became the parliament of the new Dominion. Canada's modern parliament preserves in its neo-Gothic style the soaring hopes and complex inspiration of Confederation. What was the inspiration? A House of Commons? Surely British. A Senate? Surely American. The British North America Act clearly committed Canada to a constitution similar in principle to that of the United Kingdom. This meant constitutional monarchy, with the supreme executive power vested in the reigning sovereign. It meant, too, the British tradition of the supremacy and sanctity of Parliament. And it meant, finally, adherence to the British cabinet system, under which the Prime Minister and his cabinet must normally be elected to Parliament and be responsible to it. John A. Macdonald, the Canadian Prime Minister, had privately longed for a new Dominion with one all-powerful central Parliament, as in Britain. But he knew this could not be. Canada had to preserve a multiple identity, and a unitary state was totally unacceptable to Quebec. For an example of divided sovereignty, Macdonald had to look not to unitary Britain, but to federal America. Macdonald knew that after 1783, chaos and violence had almost destroyed the first American Confederation, whose central government had been too weak. So he looked to the Federal Constitution of 1787, which had set up a stronger central government with certain specific powers. But the various states were left with all the rest, including unspecified and potential rights. Inevitably, the steady accumulation of rights by the states led to such a growth in their stature that the whole federal structure tottered. Conflicting sovereignties and states' rights running amok, Macdonald felt, underlay the tragic sectional conflicts of recent American history. The monarchist in Macdonald had little taste for the American presidential system. The American chief executive, he felt, was a creature of the electorate and too open to influence. Macdonald did adopt the American federal system, but allotted unspecified powers to the center so that any future growth in sovereignty would be safely federal. Macdonald was pleased with his new creation. Rather an odd Anglo-American beast, some thought. But he felt that he had obtained all the advantages of British central government within America's federal system. How did Uncle Sam react to the political events which so pleased Macdonald? The truth was that the problems of Reconstruction permitted him little more than passing comment. The new nation was left undisturbed to take pride in the dignified opening of the new Dominion Parliament. Confederation was just starting to walk, and the many fathers were filled with admiration. Already in the new toddler, they saw a bold and independent young man who would take his proper place beside John Bull and Uncle Sam. The dashing young man would still be British, of course, but surely Sam would now see that John Bull and his offspring were different people. Or would he?
That cocksure pose concealed many doubts. Canadian Confederation was a calculated risk. Britain gambled that her withdrawal from North America would reduce American hostility rather than whet expansionist appetites. Canada gambled that the United States would now see that she was no mere appendage of Britain and would not exploit Canadian weakness. Confederation, of course, had many causes. It was a genuine response to internal problems too big for local solution. But underlying everything was fear of the triumphant Union. At the end of the Civil War, the United States had not made use of the greatest army in the world, but manifest destiny was on the prowl, and Canada's destiny, far less manifest, had to be preserved. Thus, you could say that among the monuments to the Fathers of Confederation in Ottawa, there is one missing, the one to Uncle Sam.